Hi there, and welcome to the Creative Endeavour podcast, the podcast bringing you inspiring stories from creative professionals from around the world. And in this episode, I've got somebody very special to share with you. And in fact, he is my biggest role model, my mentor, my father, Tom Tischler. Now, I wanted to get my father on the podcast because I knew he would be able to share a unique point of view when it comes to art. And in fact, a lot of the things that I say and a lot of the lessons that I teach came directly from my father. I was really influenced by him growing up, and I must admit I'm very lucky to be raised by a successful wildlife artist. And even though he does bronze sculpture and I went into painting, a lot of these lessons still translate no matter your creative pursuit. I wanted to know, though, specifically, what does the old school offer the new school? You see, my father is one of these old school business guys, applying some old school things to his art business, and he hasn't embraced any of the new technologies. He doesn't have Instagram, Facebook, and he's got a really out-of-date website. But still, he is smashing it in the art world, and still to this day, in his 70s, he's continuing to sell big bronze pieces. So I wanted to hear more about that business side to art, but also some of his personal stories of how he got started with his art career in the first place. Now, this conversation was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so excited to share it with you now. Without further ado, here's my father, Tom Tischler, in this episode of The Creative Endeavour. Well, Tom Tischler, Dad, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you just start us off with telling us about your story and how you got into sculpting in the first place?
Well, son, my story and how I got into this in the first place. Well, I've always been an artist. I was aware that I was an artist before I ever started school. That came pretty naturally. My mother was an art history teacher and an artist, a frustrated artist, as most artists are. And she found the only way she could monetize her passion for art was to teach. So, art history. And so that meant that I came into this being aware of art history before I could form complete sentences. And one of the driving things in my life as a small child was Gardner's Art Through the Ages. And before I could walk properly, I could pull myself up to the coffee table, and there was Gardner's Art Through the Ages, and it stayed on that coffee table during my mother's entire adult life. So until I was very far an adult, Gardner's Art Through the Ages lived on that coffee table. It was central to my life. I'm sure that she knew every page in it, but it became central. It may not have been central to her life because I never saw her refer to it, but I was always looking at it. And I was particularly attracted to the prehistoric art section. And I just loved those cave paintings at Altamira and Lascaux, and I just thought that was the best art ever. And even as a small child, I was aware we had started out doing some wonderful things, and it had gone straight downhill from there. So I mean, that's a mindset that I've never gotten over.
Yeah.
So I'm still very taken with primitive art.
I'll just insert something right there, because wasn't it Pablo Picasso who went to Altamira and they came out and said, "We've learned nothing"?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And
yeah.
and of course, Altamira and Lascaux were touted for decades as being the, at 15,000 years old, they were touted as being the oldest true artwork of mankind. I mean, this was it. This was as old as it got. And now, in the last few decades, we have found work like the Chauveau Cave, which has better artwork in it,
Yeah.
better anatomy, better skill in craftsmanship, a much better body of work for whatever artist or artists. And to me, there's such similarity that I think this may be the work of one individual,
Wow.
even though they say that it spans thousands of, but listen, this artists have personal styles, and there's a great deal of consistency on the walls at Chauveau. And the art at Chauveau dates to 40,000 years, more than twice as old as Lascaux and Altamira. And still that stuff, just all of that primitive artwork speaks directly to my soul.
Yeah.
And that's, and I didn't want to go paint on the cave wall, but I was definitely interested in that. And like any other small child, I was wild about dinosaurs, and that extended on to being wild about woolly rhinoceros and mammoths and aurochs and all of these primitive giant beasts, Galiptodon, the giant armadillo, and things. And I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to see those things? But I mean, I was an artist. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I was always provided with art material and allowed to do my thing and just keep doing it. And I did. I used up lots and lots of paper and lots of pencils and crayons and chalk, and eventually was into charcoal and watercolor and then oil and so forth. I mean, it was always there for me to do, and it simply allowed me to move into that naturally. But I have to say, without guidance. Now, and I have to say that this could be positive and negative. My mother did not attempt to direct me, and the thoughts she had, without ever enunciating it, were that it was more important that I learned how to communicate non-verbally through art than it was for her to tell me what to communicate. In other words, it's more important how you think than what you think.
Yeah.
And she didn't attempt to influence me in one direction or the other. So I carry that with me as a central philosophy.
So you had the access to this stuff as a child. You were getting stuck into your creative practice without direction, as you're saying. But it was certainly something that was encouraged within your house. That's actually very rare, especially for the 50s. That's an incredibly rare thing, because I'm talking to people all the time, and the emails that I'm receiving, I get a lot that come from people, even now in this day and age. I want to be an artist, but my mom and dad won't let me. They say, you're going to go into advertising or engineering, or you're going to be a doctor, because we all know you can't make any money doing art. So was this something that was encouraged as just a mere hobby for you as a child, or was it something that you announced to your parents, hey, I'm going to be this when I grow up?
No, I think I started this before I was capable of enunciating it, of announcing it to my parents verbally. In other words, I just got my pencils or modeling clay, and I just flat got into it.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And I occupied myself that way for hours and went into my own internally constructed fantasy world and did my drawings and my sculptures and whatever. And other kids play other ways, and that's what I did to entertain myself. It's what I related to. But what you just said is important about parents saying, don't do this. My father sort of stood back and didn't direct me either. He just stood back. He was very supportive, but he just stood back and watched. And I think that's important. But when I decided that I really wanted to be an artist, and finally said that, which would have been in high school, mm-hmm. My mother simply at that point said, all right, this has gone far enough. We'll put an end to this nonsense right now. She put her foot down and said, I'm sorry, you are not going to become an artist. I know artists. I work with artists. I work in the art community. Artists starve to death. You are very creative and very talented. You will become an architect.
Wow.
Wow, thanks, Mom.
Wow.
Just what I wanted. But I had enough respect in her perspective on it and was practical enough to say, well, maybe she's right. Maybe that's what I need to do. And consequently, when I got to the University of Texas, I went into architecture school. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that helped my art immeasurably. It taught me to think logically. It taught me to think in an organized way. It taught me to discipline myself and to organize myself and to focus on what I wanted to achieve. And it taught me about planning. Mm. And without that, I don't know how the hell I would have made it as an artist when I eventually did become an artist.
Yeah. So when you were at the University of Texas, you know, and you're learning all of these new things, can you give me some maybe a specific example how something that you were learning within your university course really directly benefited something in particular about your particular artistic process?
Well, absolutely. In fact, that term, artistic process,
right, came
out of a discussion I had with a close friend who was a year ahead of me at university. And he had been listening to some lecture, and he was expounding, pontificating on this concept of the art, of the creative process. Now, he was talking specifically about architecture, mm-hmm. and that there is a creative process that you could employ. Well, this was a new concept for me, mm-hmm. and so I was very interested that perhaps there was some methodology that would help me be more creative. And so I embraced that totally. And then when I became an artist, I found through experience that there were lots of methodologies, separate methodologies, like the artistic process, like project management, mm-hmm. like business planning, mm-hmm. like risk management or financial planning, that applied directly to me as an artist. And I was able to have enough perspective on this, enough distance from it, to realize this is what I have learned is actually for architecture, but I can modify the methodology to fit this other trade. Mm-hmm. Art being a separate trade, although very close to architecture. Mm-hmm. I mean, they share a lot of similarities. In fact, if you look at architectural the architectural history textbook of monuments of architecture and compare that to Art Through the Ages, the art history book, you you realize that there's a very soft and blurry line. In fact, much of the art in the art history book is on the walls of those monuments.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah.
And so there's a blurring of that. It's a continuity there. So it's not a long reach, but I was pulled out of that out of the art world and put into a field with much more rigorous training. And I think that was, I don't think just highly beneficial. I think that was critical to my eventual success as an artist. Absolutely critical. I don't think I could have done it without it.
It's interesting because, so while you're in your architecture course, were you thinking this stuff at the time, going, okay, look, I'm here now. I can see the practicality behind what my mother is saying. I'm here now. I'm studying. This is going to help me be a better artist. Or are you only seeing that benefit in retrospect?
I'm only seeing the benefit in retrospect. At the time, my focus was on being a better architect.
Yeah. So you had jumped into this new thing, and that was your intention at the time, to be an architect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
But, I mean, look, I had just come through a period of my entire time in high school. My focus was I'm going to become a veterinarian, because my father was a veterinarian. So I was thinking that, and I worked for my father in his clinic as a kennel hand, as a veterinary assistant, hold the cats while they get their vaccination, hold the dog while its foot is bandaged or whatever. I mean, I did that for years. And I see some real interest and similarity there, because during those high school years and before, I was really involved in animal anatomy. And here again, we see a correlation, a juxtaposition that's hard to say how much did that help. Hell, I know my anatomy. Yeah. I knew that because I thought I was going to be a veterinarian, and I started studying my veterinary, the things I thought were important to being a veterinarian. I started studying those early, maybe at year 9 or 8, 9, 10, something like that in school. I was already looking at my father's textbooks and saying, this is where I'm going. Mm-hmm. And then I made the decision that two things. One, I didn't believe I was going to get into veterinary school, that it took more brains than I had. That was a personal belief. And I think it was very incorrect, mm-hmm. but it was my perception at the time. Mm-hmm. And it was, so I was also unhappy with having to deal with my father's clients. Right. That I didn't have any problem taking care of their cats and dogs, but some of these people were just, I'm sorry, I just didn't want to talk to them. And I didn't want to make a living talking to them.
Fair enough.
And so I said, if somebody would allow me just to do the surgery, mm-hmm. if I could just do veterinary surgery and leave it at that, I'd be happy. I extracted myself from the idea that I was, one, able to become a veterinarian, and two, maybe it's a justification, but I decided that I didn't want to be. Yeah. So when I embraced architecture, I embraced it wholeheartedly.
Mm-hmm. I remember some of the stories from when I was young, of you telling me about your past and how you got into art. Before we get into the art aspect, the architecture actually led you to some pretty interesting places in the world, and also some major political stuff that was going on in the United States. Now, we don't have to get into that if you don't want, but can you tell me, how did you end up traveling with this, with your architecture? Is there a
I
better,
don't want to avoid that. No.
is there a better
no,
way that I can
that's-
ask it? Is there a better?
No, I think that's good. I think that's fine. I'm just trying to decide how do I approach that, and how do I say that? I had we'll say a philosophical disagreement with my uncle. That's my uncle Sam. Perhaps you know him. He We had a little disagreement about the ethics and morality involved in killing other people. And so I became and was registered as a conscientious objector, and decided that there was a saying that was popular at the time among those people who didn't understand. America, love it or leave it, and that meant fall into line or piss off. They wanted you out. And I said, you know what? I'm not even offended by that. I think you got a point there. And so I just bundled up and left for Europe.
Right.
And as soon as I hit Europe, I reverted instantly back into art mode.
Right.
That wasn't even a hesitation.
Was this during the time you were at the University of Texas?
It was at the end of university, yes.
So you didn't actually have a chance to finish your studies?
No.
How far into your studies did you get before you were called into Vietnam?
3 years of a 4-year course.
Wow. So you hit Europe. Where's the first place that you get to?
Well, I got to the first entry point was Reykjavik, Iceland. So I spent 2 weeks in Reykjavik, Iceland, and I spent the entire time painting watercolors.
Wow.
I just did landscapes, watercolor landscapes. And I was highly influenced by Ted Kautsky's books, which I had brought with me in the luggage. I mean, when you're packing to go to Europe, what do you carry? Books. I carried Ted Kautsky. Yeah. And I was interested in Kautsky, had become aware of Kautsky, and started to follow Kautsky because Kautsky allowed me to do architectural perspectives and renderings and so forth. And he improved the way my architecture looked, even though he was a landscape artist. And I loved his style, and so I started to emulate his style. And then I saw that he had a book on watercolor, so I got that book, studied that book, and so when I got to Iceland, I started doing and amassing a body of work only over a 2-week period, but it still amounted to dozens and dozens of watercolors. And so I was concerned about money, very concerned about money. And so I approached an art gallery to see if they could sell or take some of my work or do something. And they said no, they were filled up, they didn't have any room, and they just simply would not buy anything outright, that was their policy. And that me moving on, staying in Iceland was problematic. Well, it should have been obvious. But the lady was nice, and she said she would like to see my folio, which I was holding under my arm. And so I handed her the folio. She opened it up, spread the paintings out on the desk, just stood there looking at it. Then she called someone out of the back room. that someone was the owner. She said, "You've got to come in here and look at this." And so the other lady came in and looked at the artwork and said, "Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's Surtsey, and that's this place, and that's the other place." And "Oh, that's wonderful." And they said, "Well, what do you want for these?" And I put a price on it. It was something in the neighborhood of $10 a piece.
Good money back then.
And big money for me. Big money at that time. I mean, this is 1968.
Mm-hmm.
$10 a piece, and I was starting with that and was willing to negotiate. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Just a minute." And they looked in their purses and they bought all of it.
Wow.
They just bought the lot. And I was very pleased with that.
Well, of course. So they go from saying, "Hey, we don't buy artwork outright. That's not our policy." Then you show them, and now suddenly they've changed their policy.
And not only that, they reached in their own pockets,
wow.
And they bought it for themselves and for gifts. They did not buy it to put in the gallery.
Yes.
Yeah. That they personally wanted it. Well, I found that very gratifying and encouraging, as you would. And so I had maybe $250 or $300 or something like that. And that covered all the expenses while we were in Iceland and then some.
Wow. Fantastic.
Wow. So that was great. So then we went on to the continent and we picked up a Volkswagen Kombi at the factory in Westphalia, Germany. And we proceeded to tour Europe. That is your mother and I. We proceeded to tour Europe and visit all of the architectural monuments I had studied and all of the wild areas and bird refuges and national parks and art museums and whatever there was. And your mother was an artist at that time. And so we had overlapping interests, and Europe was just a smorgasbord of wonderful things to focus on. And so we started setting up and painting the monuments, the architectural monuments. And it's easy because you simply get a brochure about whatever the community has to offer, and they'll tell you which monuments they're very proud of. And when you go there, there will be tourist buses full of American tourists who have been brought over to see the monument. And so when they get to the monument, well, there's someone sitting on the wall just in front of the monument, painting the monument. And they get to see the artist at work, and they get an opportunity to buy the painting that they see the artist doing.
Yeah, that's a good little business strategy right
there. So it worked very well. And it was funny, though. I found that they were primarily American tourists, and that they were disappointed when they found out that I was an American. They would have much rather that I'd been Norwegian or Dutch or French or anything but just another damn Yank. So I decided that the main thing to do was to keep my mouth shut. So they would come up and they would get out their phrase book and then try it in French or something, and I'd look at them like, "What the hell are you on about?" And they'd say, finally they'd point to something and it would say, "How much is this?" And then I knew where it was because I had the same phrase book, everybody did, and I'd flip through and I'd point to whatever price this is $5.
Yeah.
And I'd point to that, and they'd get out the money, and I would put their wet watercolor on an envelope for them to put in later, and they would grab their painting and run for the bus because the driver's already angry because they're not moving to the next destination already, and that this person is waiting for their painting.
Wow.
And so we just sold, and both your mother and I sold and sold and sold on the street.
Wow.
And so we were on the streets of Europe for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And winter started coming on. And we had been to most of the countries, Sweden, Norway, didn't ever get to Finland, but Sweden and Norway. And I thought we would be moving towards Sweden because that was sort of a destination for draft dodgers. And but when I got to Sweden, they showed me what winter was going to look like, and I said, and this is us jumping naked into a hole in the ice in the lake. And I'm thinking, not this Texas boy. I will not survive this. And I had a friend, an architect whose wife was Norwegian. And she had made several years before an offhand comment over dinner that if she had any city in the world where she would like to live, it would be Zurich, Switzerland. And so as winter came on, we headed for Zurich. Why didn't I understand that that was going to be the coldest place you could possibly go?
Wow.
And that it wouldn't be long and I would be under the ice in the lake of Zurich. Wow. And it was just interesting. But I think that when you're out on your own and you don't have any options, it forces you into a mode, into a position where you cannot afford to be timid. You're responsible for yourself. You have to step up and take advantage of an opportunity. So when we reached Zurich, we drove down the street. It was raining that evening, and we were driving, and it was late. It was just at dark, and we passed a sign on the side of a main road in the city, and it said Zoological Museum. And I'm driving in the rain, and I saw that sign, and I just said, tomorrow morning, I'm going into the museum and get a job. Because we're going to need money.
Yeah.
Well, we already had more money than we started with because we'd sold artwork. Mm-hmm. It more than covered our cost of camping in the van and the fuel and the food we required. Yeah. So the next morning I went into the museum and got a job. And well, that doesn't sound reasonable. Why would you expect someone would just walk in and the first thing they ask for, they get? But I approached it very differently. I was at the museum when it opened. I had my clipboard, which I am never without.
You like your clipboards, I know.
As you know.
As I know.
I'm never without my clipboard.
Yeah.
When the museum opened, I not only was the first one in, hey, I was the only one in. Nobody wanted to go to the museum. It was middle of the week and it was, but I got in there and I toured the museum and I wrote down everything that I thought could be improved.
Wow. Okay.
I just walked through and I said, this could be improved, that could be improved, the other could be improved. What about this? What about the other? And then and this was almost at walking pace. I mean, I would walk, I would look, I would stop, I would make a note, I would move on. Mm-hmm. And I had about 100 items on the list. Mm-hmm. Some general, some specific. Then I went downstairs to the reception and the entry area, and I said who I was, as though that made any difference, and that I'd like to have an appointment with the director, and when could they do that? And the secretary called, spoke to him, and he said he can talk to you in about 15 minutes if you just sit here. And in about 10 minutes, the director came down and invited me into his office. And I said, I'm an artist, and I've looked over your museum, and here's what I think I can do for you, and here's a list. And here is a portfolio of recent work, that is what I'd done over the last 3 months, which didn't sell. Mm-hmm. And it covered everything. I mean, it was everything. It was landscapes of the forest. It was paintings of mushrooms and flowers and birds and animals, and trips to the zoo and trips to the art museum and architectural monuments, and just, it was a wide range of stuff. Mm-hmm. And he looked at the material, and he looked at the list, and he said, when can you start? And I said, now, right now, I'm here. We're ready to go.
Right.
And so they found me an office and he set things for me to set tasks for me to do, and primarily insects to draw and paint, and hey, off and running. Within a week, your mother secured a position at the dental institute in the surgery department as a medical illustrator, based on the quality of her drawings mm-hmm. of human skulls from the Texas Memorial Museum at Austin, Texas, where we went to school. And she had, in her folio, she had these skull drawings. And the surgeon in charge there that hired her looked at it and said, you know how to draw teeth. You know how to draw skulls. I need you.
Wow.
And so she was employed, I was employed, and we went on from there.
So you're working this job. You've landed on your feet now in Europe, and what I really want to know, because this is still what I'm unsure about from being really familiar with your story growing up, is that catalyst. Then, like, you're getting into the artwork now, you're producing it on your way through Europe, but you still haven't made that plunge into full-time art and jumping all in. I want to know what was that moment like for you? Do you remember the time and place where it was like, I have to do this and this alone? There's no job, there's no nothing else. It is just about the art for me.
Yeah. Well, it was years later. I mean, I traveled extensively, being an architect slash artist, but jack of all trades. In that sort of field, in the creative, jack of all creative trades, whatever was needed, I could provide, and I did quite a bit of traveling. And it was years later when the decision, the opportunity came, when I became aware that that's what I was going to do. And can I remember it? I can remember it vividly, like it was yesterday. I can tell you it was a Wednesday afternoon.
Wow. It
was about 3:00 in the afternoon. Your mother lived, and I lived in Austin at that point, Austin, Texas. And I had decided that I wanted to, we had been in Africa for several years, and I decided that I wanted to start a business to sell safaris, both hunting safaris and photographic safaris and cultural safaris, to Ethiopia primarily, but other African countries. And I thought this would be a reasonable way to continue to be able to have contact with Africa and make a living. And so I contacted someone I had met in Ethiopia, and they invited me to an art show in San Antonio, Texas. Mm-hmm. Now, at the time, I didn't realize it was an art show. It was actually a big game hunters convention.
Wow.
And so they were selling everything in there: hunts, safari clothing, travel, camera equipment, whatever, anything you can imagine that those people would be interested in, and all of it high dollar stuff. Mm-hmm. Now, I wasn't there to look at wildlife art, mm-hmm. but the person I was with wanted to buy a piece of artwork. And so I accompanied them. I went with them. And so we looked at several pieces. And finally I said, I don't know. I'm just concerned here. I know about animals, and I don't understand this. We were looking particularly at bronze sculpture at that point. I don't know a whole lot about bronze. I mean, I've got a general idea about how it's done, and I've done some jewelry casting and stuff like that. But I'm not, this is all new to me, and I can tell you this, that I don't think these people know about animals. They don't have experience with I don't know this. The animals, anatomically, behaviorally, this doesn't read right to me. I don't, so I don't, you do what you want, but there's something wrong here. I mean, let's look this greater kudu. Its horns aren't built this way. Mm-hmm. The horns don't come out of its head this way. Right. We need something different. I think I could do that well. I said that.
Wow. Okay.
And so then I said, I don't know about this. And so then we looked at some more pieces, and I said something like, I think I'd be able to do this. Then we looked at a few more pieces and met some other artists, and these were the big name artists, the worldwide known big name artists that were at this. Yeah. The big guys. And I said, again, I think that I can do this, and I think I want to do this.
Right.
And the person I was with turned to me and said, well, Tommy, if that's what you think, just do it.
Wow.
And I said, you're right. We left there, said our goodbyes. I went to the telephone. This is back in the time of analog phones attached to the wall with paper phone books dangling on the end of a chain.
Yeah.
And I looked up art supplies and found that there was an art supply very close to the convention center, within walking distance. And I called them and said, I'd like to do bronze sculpture. Do you have the materials that are required and some instruction on how to do that? And they said, absolutely. And I said, great, I'm on my way. And I walked down there and I bought 5 pounds of modeling clay and a handful of tools and a book on how to do it, which should have been titled How Not to Do It. I didn't know that. It took me years to figure that out. And I went home, and I then was faced with, well, what will I do?
Yeah.
And so I decided that I liked elephants. I'd seen some elephants, and I thought I knew something about elephants, and I had something to say about elephants, and I felt very emotional about elephants, and I'd do an elephant. I didn't know where to begin, so I started with my own experiences, and I decided that I should draw blueprints of an elephant and approach this the same way I would architecture. So I drew drawings of elephants. I drew several drawings of elephants, but then when I finally settled on a pose, I did front view, back view, side views, top view, bottom view, everything I could, details. I decided what that was going to look like. And so my planning and drawing skills already helped. I should say that before I left that show, I went to the office, to the reception for the convention, and I said, I'd like to show my artwork in this convention. And I understand that you meet, that the next time will be 24 months from now, that it's every 2 years. And she said, yes, that'll be fine. And here's the information on it, and gives you all the information about being a prospective artist. So they were prepared to consider somebody. And she said, but I'll tell you now that you would have to be sponsored by a member as a prerequisite, and that it would have to be, your inclusion in the art show would have to be approved by the board. They would look at your artwork and decide whether they wanted you in their art show or not. Mm-hmm. And I said, fine, that's understandable. And then she said, that's great. What kind of artwork do you do? And I said, I do bronze sculpture.
Haven't done any yet.
how long have you been doing it? And I said, I haven't started.
Oh, wow.
And she said, well, I will tell you right now, this is the highest pinnacle you can reach in wildlife art. And there is I do not mean to be discouraging, but there's absolutely no possibility that you will be in this art show in 2 years. And I said, thank you. I will see you in 2 years.
Oh my God, Dad.
And now that's pretty gutsy and pretty bold.
That's a pretty bold statement, isn't it?
And furthermore, it seems that this is imprudent, and I wouldn't recommend it for anyone else. And it sounds like I was under the influence of something. Either I'd been drinking or stoned out of my gourd on God knows what. Doesn't seem reasonable, rational, logical. None of that is good behavior or anything that you would think would be reasonable. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't. The truth of the matter is that I had been hijacked.
By what?
And I didn't realize it at the time.
Yeah.
My brain had been hijacked by a small plasmodium. A plasmodium is a little animal, larger than a bacteria, that lives in your blood. And this one happened to be quinine-resistant malaria. And malaria had taken over my brain and was having a little party in there, eating my brain for me. Thank you very much. Actually, not eating the brain, but eating the blood cells in my brain that my brain needed to function. Right. So as a matter of fact, I was stoned out of my gourd, but it was the malaria talking.
Wow.
Well, so I did get my stuff for my elephant, but before I could start my elephant, I needed to have a week in the hospital.
Wow. Okay. So is your bout with malaria kind of lulling you into this false sense of, this almost self-aggrandizing, overconfident approach? Is that what was happening there when you look at this person sitting at the desk and she's telling you no way, and you're like, yes way, it's happening. See you in 2 years.
Yeah. Well, this is very much. I don't see that there's any difference between what happened to me and being drunk.
Right.
They're both oxygen deprivation to the brain.
Yeah. Right.
And so, okay, so I was drunk. That's the way it was. And so I got over my malaria. It was rugged. It
Yeah.
was a bad time in the hospital,
Yeah.
and the whole thing was rough. I mean, I was delirious.
Hmm.
They had to be taken to the hospital by ambulance.
Wow.
I mean, I just came unglued,
Yeah.
and it was really bad.
Hmm.
But when I came around, there was my lump of modeling clay and my elephant plans, my dream to do an elephant.
Hmm.
And somehow, while my brain was in a severely deranged state,
Hmm.
I had focused on a new star in the sky on which to chart my course. And having changed my ship bearings, I was off in a new direction, and there was no turning back,
Right.
no varying the course. I knew where I had to go.
Hmm.
I knew what I had to do to get there,
Hmm.
and I was determined to make that happen.
So over the course of the next few years, as you're building up your work, because I do want to finally address the rhino in the room and the billy goat and the turkeys and the jackrabbit and the gorilla. For people listening to the audio version of this podcast, you can also find the video version of this podcast on YouTube, and you will see in the background behind my father all of these fantastic sculptures which he started in recent years. So this period of time when you just are getting into your art and you're starting to build up this body of work, what happens then? How did you end up turning this into a business? Because I remember, just to kind of cut ahead a little bit here, I benefited from a lot of the success that you had in terms of the lessons that you were able to give to me. And I remember you actually went into it being relatively successful from the outset. When you hear about the trajectory of many other people's art career, you actually had a pretty meteoric rise to success pretty early on, where you were able to sustain your creative production. So can you walk us through that, what that process was like for you and how you managed it?
Well, there was a learning curve in the beginning. My first few pieces were naive compared to later pieces, and you would expect that. I certainly would think that anyone who practices something will improve.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was no different with me. It did improve, but I did start off at a pretty high level. So remember, my objective wasn't to be, I didn't have a goal to be the best in the world. I didn't have a goal to be anything other than I thought that I could beat the other competition that I saw. So that's where that was my objective, was if I'm going to compete successfully in this market, I have to do at least that well. And I was able to do that well from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very lucky. But hey, I had an entire childhood behind me of drawing and sculpting and painting.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of experience, which I gained from architecture school. I had a lot of experience, which I gained from the work that I had, architectural and
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, after that point. And I certainly, because I had spent 5 years in Africa working in the national park system as an architect, I had enormous backlog of experience with animals.
Yeah. And it's animals that is your main subject. I mean, that's primarily what you do, with the exception of a couple of figures that I've seen you do. It's mainly wildlife, isn't it?
Right, and I only consider that humans are just another species of animal.
All right.
So I don't see that as any different. We
Sure.
have the same bones, the same Latin names on the anatomy. It's no different. Humans are no different to me than the animals. I mean, it's not like there are animals and then there are people. It's there are animals and we are one of them.
Okay.
That's fine. That's fine. I don't have any problem with that, and I easily reach over and get into people.
So I've seen all of this new work behind you, and it's actually been a few years since I've been into your studio. But you have some of that early stuff there from this period of time?
Well, I have. I don't have a good collection personally of my own work. That was never important to me, but I do have a few of the early pieces, and I can show you one piece in particular. Let me just step over there to do that,
Sure.
and I'll pick it up off the shelf.
And this is obviously going to be in the video version if you're listening to this podcast. All right,
So
you're back. You got
All
it.
right, I'm back. Good. So this piece is a little on the dusty side and unloved, but it gives you an example of one of the early pieces and the quality that I was able to produce for that particular market.
Right.
And so this is a very early bronze, and it's about 3.5 inches tall and about 5 inches in length.
That's fantastic, man.
And
Yeah.
it appealed to the people that I was marketing to,
Yeah.
and it was able to compete for quality and price very nicely with the rest of the market. And
Wait a second. I'm gonna stop you right there, Dad, because you're throwing out a few words and you're talking in a way that indicates to me, and I'm becoming a little more aware of this now that we're talking about this. It indicates to me that you're starting off now with your architecture, with your art. Beg your pardon. You're starting off with all of this benefit of your childhood, architecture, all of this, and now you're coming into it with an actual understanding of competing in the marketplace and talking about this as if it's a business. So that's something I do want to get into, because how would you even know or go about creating work that would fit into this in order to be able to compete favorably and be successful? Like, how did
well,
you even know to make that move?
it was obvious. First, it was blind luck.
Right.
Okay, so I was not interested in business per se.
Okay.
I was aware of business because architects have to be aware of business to be able to design buildings that will support their clients' needs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're building a fill in the blank, a book bindery or a car factory or whatever it happens to be, you need to understand the terminology and the function of business at different levels, all aspects of it. And you need to do something where your architecture is going to support your client's needs. Otherwise, you're not helping at all. Mm-hmm. So I did have some awareness. What all I really wanted to do was to sculpt animals, and I insisted that they had to be as good as I could do. Mm-hmm. And I knew that if my animals were better, the people that were the potential buyers in this big game hunting fraternity would be more likely to buy my work than they would if my work wasn't good. And I also realized that price was probably a factor. And so I needed to offer the highest quality that I could provide at the lowest price that I could manage and still make a living. So that's a pretty simple concept.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a simple concept, yeah. Amazingly effective.
Yeah, it's not terribly sophisticated. I mean, it's just it seems to be sort of an obvious sort of thing.
It's fine. Well, it might not be sophisticated or have the sexiness of like this really grand, complicated business plan or anything, but you stumbled onto something that worked. And as soon as you had that magic formula, it just seems that you carried the scene. You kept doing and doing and doing. So give us a snapshot about where you are today. Let's jump right ahead now, because now let me
Well,
just
now let's not. Let me just insert into the middle of that what
okay.
happened in between. I
Okay.
started off I started off with an excellent business model.
Yeah,
And then I looked around and thought, this is so easy. This will apply to other areas as well.
sure.
And I wasted years following wild geese around in the darkness.
Are you referring to the Perth Zoo days?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I'm referring to other art markets and ways of other business models and other markets which I approached and could not make work.
Give me an example of what you couldn't make work.
All right, for example, I decided that it took, now this was just from a personal observation. Uh, I decided that it took three things to close an art sale. That the person had to have enough money to buy it. They had to be wealthy enough to buy a piece of artwork, and art in general is a luxury item. They had to have an interest in the subject material. It had to be something that they liked, that they were interested in, that they felt personally about. And then they had to have the feeling that they wanted to or should collect art. And if you didn't have, they felt there was some intrinsic, you could be very interested in the subject, but if you didn't think art had intrinsic value, you weren't going to sell to this person. They were not going to buy it if they didn't feel that way. So I had to have those three. So I looked around and I found that there were other areas where I thought the key element here was money, the first one. They had to be able to afford it. So being in Texas, I looked at the horse market. A lot of show horses, a lot of different breeds, a lot of different functions. Horses might be great. Another one was very parallel to that. There was obviously a lot of the people that were cattle breeders, not meat producers, but cattle breeders. They had big ranches, they had lots of money, and they had particular breeds of cattle. So I basically wasted about 18 months to 2 years trying to do horses and cattle for my Texas clients who also were interested in hunting locally. In the meantime, the international hunting market, the safari market, if you will, continued to buy my work. So that was bread and butter, but I became distracted by thinking I should work this thing closer to home. Now, what I didn't understand at that point was that as an artist, I'm not a manufacturer, I'm not big business. My objective is now, and should have been then, don't get greedy with it. Decide what you need. Your objective should be to be able to afford to continue to do your artwork. How do I take care of my family and continue to be an artist?
That's right.
That should be the limit of it. Don't go beyond that. Don't think this is a get rich quick scheme. It's not.
Well, I think if you have the thing that I'm learning, the older I get, is if you have that creative fulfillment from a sustained creative production, then that's more valuable than anything monetary anyway. That's
Yes,
far more valuable because
yes.
when I think about it, it doesn't matter how much money comes in or how well I'm doing financially to a point within reason. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, you still
Having
have to make a living.
having more, you have to make a living, sure, but getting then more and more and more and going for the next sell and the next big kill and keep going, keep going, keep going. There's a certain point where you realize, well, all I want to do is paint anyway, or in your case, sculpt. That's all I want to do. So if I'm doing that, I'm happy. I'm good. I'm happy. So I totally appreciate that, and I can actually see from just listening to you again now where I got a lot of this stuff from.
Right. Well, let me tell you another big mistake I made, because we learn from others' mistakes, or we should. You don't want to have to make all these mistakes yourself. You should watch other people step in it and say, I'm not going there. Uh, I did an awful lot of one-man shows, one or two a month, one or two a month for a
What?
long time.
I
I
didn't realize
drug
it
you.
was that frequent.
Oh God, yeah, it was hey, you have to sell. Now I was out there, I was making sales, but my objective, what I told myself, and that's pretty much the truth, it's not the individual sale is not my objective. I'm happy to make an individual sale. I'm looking for patrons. I'm looking for collectors. I'm looking for somebody who's going to buy one of almost everything I do. That's where, because you go to art shows and you spend an inordinate amount of time talking to people. A lot of them, the vast majority of them, will be tire kickers. They're wasting your time. I was doing shows, some of them one-man shows, some of them connected to the hunting fraternity. They were all over the United States. I got a Suburban, and I drug a 4-horse trailer, horse trailer. And I drug it coast to coast and did the show circuit. And I sold a lot. But I realized somewhere out driving across the desert in Nevada or somewhere that this wasn't what I wanted to do. I did not want to be a truck driver.
Wow. Yeah.
That this is, yes, you can make money doing this, but at what cost? This living on the road, I'm neglecting my family. When I say I'm neglecting, I'm not there to take care of you, and I'm absent for too long a period of time, and I'm exhausted by having to drive to the location, set the show up, work the booth, and then box it all up again, load it back in the trailer, and drive to the next destination. And it's rough when you have one show in Atlanta and the next one is in San Diego. You're driving across the continent. And when I drove across there were others, not artists necessarily, but other commercial members working the same show. And we stayed at the same motels, and we passed each other on the highway and waved and honked, and we knew each other. It's like gypsies in a caravan moving cross country. It's a very strange lifestyle. It's a lifestyle I chose to try to move away from.
Right. Right.
So I needed something different.
A gallery.
Not a gallery. Well, I had already tried the gallery path. That was another mistake I went down. I thought, well, okay, galleries know all the people with money, and the people with money come to the galleries, and they spend their money at the galleries, and and for them finding a buyer for you, they're going to take a percentage. And so it's obvious that you have to build some of that percentage into the price. And you don't have the contact with the buyer that you would if you made the sale directly. But so it has good and bad points, and all you have to do is have enough galleries and to make the numbers come out. You just have to make it up in volume. So I selected a group of galleries spread out across mostly the southern part of the United States. And I had extremely painful experiences trying that model. And right. in a nutshell, I don't have a lot of good things to say. I don't have anything good things to say about them. I'm sorry, but I mean, I'm still angry and bitter about the experiences that I had with them.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because and I do want to get more into the business side of things, because looking at you and your business model, you've made this work independent of galleries, but also independent of the online realm. As for me,
that online realm
wasn't even a
simply
thing.
Not a possibility.
It wasn't even a thought.
It didn't exist.
Yeah,
no.
It wasn't even a thought. But you had this, so you had to make it work on your own. For me, I think it's relatively easier because I'm able to communicate with clients a little bit more readily, and we now live in a global community. Everybody's connected, so. I say to my students now and people that listen, there's never been a better time to be an artist. But there you are in the 70s and 80s. The best you can do is pick up the phone. You can't send an email. You could send them a letter by snail mail.
I did. Well, I had a newsletter, which I went down to I either ran it off at the copy shop or I had somebody print up 200 letters, and I hand addressed the envelopes and licked the stamp personally and sent and usually wrote a personal note at the bottom or on the top of each one to the individual I was sending it to. It was the personal contact. Mm-hmm. And therein lies another important factor. Your clients are as interested in their personal relationship with you as they are interested in your artwork. They want to be able to say they knew the art, they know the artist. They want to be able to tell their friends. They pick up something off their desk or off their mantelpiece and say, this piece was done by my good friend.
Do you think the gallery model would have can work if that one policy was enacted where the client and the artist could meet?
No, I don't. I think that there's more wrong with it than that. I think that it's a flawed business model from the beginning. I think it is based on what I call the lemonade stand model. And that is, you set up a card table and a folding chair out on the edge of the street, and you get 2 lemons and half a cup of sugar and a pitcher of ice water, and you put up a little sign that says lemonade 5 cents. And then somebody wanders by and decides to buy a glass of lemonade from you for 5 cents. That is the gallery model. Mm-hmm. They think that they get people to come into their gallery by having an exhibition or show, and so they have some gala night where they invite one or more artists to display their work, and they provide wine and cheese, and people come out of the woodwork. The tire kickers come out in force to eat the wine and cheese and hobnob and think that they're doing something cultural, and you make enough sales to cover the cost of the wine and cheese. Now, I'm sorry, but this is not the way to do it. Now, if an art dealer has now this statement will date me again, has a Rolodex. A Rolodex is a telephone number file that is a complete circle, and so you can flip through the file and pick out someone's number. If they have a list of buyers which they represent, and they don't even have to have your artwork present, they just need a picture of it. In today's world, this is really easy. They can contact their buyers and say, I have an opportunity for you today only. If you'll get back in touch with me now, you can buy this painting.
Yes.
If not, I have to offer it to someone else.
Yeah.
But you're next on the list. Do you want it? Yes or no? And they sell everything basically before you could even go to the store and buy the wine and cheese. That's a different model. I only know a few art dealers in the entire world that operate that way. Well, they're probably worth working with.
I'm only gonna. Sorry, I like to argue with you, Dad. I do remember there's one art dealer who I managed to have a fantastic relationship with for over 12 years. And him and his wife running that gallery down in Applecross, you'll remember, Applecross Fine Art, Colin and Gay Dixon.
Remember it well.
And
remember it well.
You'll recall from that, Colin and Gay were the only people that would actually have a client in the gallery ready to buy a work and then call me up to come in and meet them. And we worked it out in such a way where we had an amazing working relationship that lasted for years. But it was also, okay, so it might have been a limiting factor that it was in a physical location and could not move around. So yeah, I can take the point about being a lemonade stand of sorts. However, the market and the climate, at the time in Perth for buying art, it was a really good time as well. So there were a lot of things going for it. But I think what it came down to at the end of the day is we had a winning combination of, I was young, I was producing some nice big paintings, but I had the right agent.
I think so. I think that if you're not, if you're not going to use the gallery model, you then must have a different business model which you will use.
Yeah.
So, okay, if that's not it, what model will you use? That's the next question. So there are problems, as far as I'm concerned, there are problems, insurmountable problems with the gallery business model. The primary one is that it's a single location, and I need to sell more bronze than that. I need to sell to a larger market. So I set about trying to locate other alternative markets that had a different profile.
So quarter horses and prize bulls didn't work. Driving this horse trailer all across the United States didn't work. You hit the wall with that. What was the thing that actually ended up sticking?
Well, I tried two simultaneously. I tried museums, particularly zoological, natural history museums, as a possible clientele. And I worked that very hard, put a lot of money into developing that market. And then I worked zoos. And I put an equal amount, maybe even more money into developing the zoo market. But I have to say, what you do, you try different things, and if something is successful, you do more of that. So zoos were more successful, so I eventually dropped attempting to sell to museums at all, because it was more trouble than it was worth, because zoos had picked up the slack. And now it's been 25 or 30 years exclusively zoos.
So give me, I remember you telling me, but give me some sort of idea now as to how many bronzes or how many different zoos have your work as of 2019.
I would say that there are probably 250 life-sized animals out there in about 150 zoos.
Wow. And so once a zoo buys, I mean, I know they actually end up buying more than one life-size bronze. Yeah.
Some do. Some
Yeah.
do. Depends on whether they can afford it and whether they appreciate the value of the bronze to their institution.
Yeah.
It is a lot of that is the insight of the director. Does the director think that this improves his facility?
Talk to me about how this now works as a business then. How do you even approach this? It seems like the most complicated thing. It's like, oh yeah, I'll just get my bronze in a zoo. Can you walk me through the steps as to how that actually ends up eventuating?
Well, you do not do that by visiting the zoo, by going to the zoo. You do because you don't, if you go to the river fishing, you do not pick out a single fish and try to dangle the hook in front of it. You go and you throw your hook in the water where lots of fish are, and the fish decides which one is going to bite it. It's not your decision. It's beyond our control.
Right. Yeah.
Now, sometimes you can make that work, and sometimes if it doesn't work, just pick up a rock and bash the fish with it, and that's one way to achieve it. But realistically, we just have no control over when somebody wants to do it. And a lot of potential clients want the piece, but it takes time, particularly because zoos and museums are institutions. It takes time for them to get the money together. This is expensive stuff. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars for each one of these things. And so it's not, they don't have the discretionary funds to just say, fine, or very rarely, some of them do. Oh, I like that, I'll have it. They don't operate as individuals. They've got to go back and find the money. Now, their budgets are designated for things like feeding their animals. Mm-hmm. So fair enough. And you certainly want to make sure you take care of your animals first. That's the priority. So there's no budget left over for that. So I have found that zoos don't actually buy bronze. Now, wait a minute. My entire market is zoos. The zoo doesn't buy the bronze. Someone in the community decides to buy the bronze for their zoo. Now, I didn't see that one coming. I should have been obvious, but I didn't see it. But when I did see it, I recognized it and I took advantage of it.
So now we're getting into a realm where this is artwork done through philanthropy.
Exactly. That's just what I have gravitated towards, and I have gravitated towards it because it is the easiest way for me to make a very reasonable living.
So let's say you're fishing for zoos here. I can't imagine you're taking your handwritten envelopes, your newsletters, licking the envelope, stamping it and sending it out there to a bunch of zoos. What form is this taking? How do you approach the zoo? And is it based first on, hey, I want to sculpt a rhino or I want a gorilla, or how does that work?
Well, it can work one of several ways. I mean, there is some flexibility in it, and so for me, it works many different ways. First, I approach the market. I approach it as a market, as an entity, not as individual zoos. Now, the zoo market happens to be comprised of about 500 registered, they call it accredited zoos in the United States, about 500 of them.
Wow.
And a bunch of smaller facilities that are not accredited. So the big one's about 5. So that's a very small market to work. You got 500 clients. Mm-hmm. All right. So to approach that, I cannot afford to travel to 500 different American cities to visit their zoos. And when you get there, their director's not available. They don't have time to talk to you. Sure. They're not thinking about this and so forth. So I found that every year, the Zoo Association, that professional organization to which all zoo professionals belong, are members, they have an annual convention. So I do one-man art shows. That's what I do. So knowing that I'm not going to sell anything off the bat at the show, I would go to the convention, buy a double or triple booth, because my work's big. I'm not going to get it in a 10 by 12 foot space. I set up the best looking art show I possibly can, and I put out my bronzes, and I start shaking hands and introducing myself and talking to people. And I did that. I did that for years and years, many years. So out of about 30 years of doing that, I went to the conventions for 20 years. And I shook hands and talked to and met not just directors, but anybody that wanted to talk to me or talk about artwork or whatever. And my name got out there. They knew me as an individual. Every year they'd have an opportunity to see me. And in business terms, being able to see someone face to face once a year is a lot. Now for me, that was exhausting. That means I'd go and I'd be talking to 2,500 people.
Wow.
And trying to remember them.
It's a tall order.
A tall order, difficult, hard on you. You have to keep J. Edgar Hoover files on these people and maybe even get snapshots and things so that you can speak to them on a first name basis when you see them a year later.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to be intent on developing your personal relationship with your clients. And I think that is important no matter what business model you use.
Can I just insert right there just a little, because I appreciate that so much. I remember you telling me that from an early age. I was on an artist in residency recently. So it had been several years since I had actually been on this vessel. And I'm there, I'm set up to do my show, I'm getting ready to do classes, and in walks this familiar face. And it's been years since I've seen him. And I just reached out my hand. I said, "Hello, mister." I won't reveal his name, but I said, "It's a pleasure to see you again." And he wasn't a celebrity or anybody famous or anything. He's just one of these wealthy people that lived on the ship. As the artist in residency finished up and I was leaving, packing down my show, he made a point of coming by the show with his wife again to shake my hand. And he said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man. I am so impressed with you." And I'll be like, oh, okay, thank you. Why? What's up? I was thinking he was making a comment about my art. He said, you remembered my name. I said, of course. Of course. But I didn't realize the effect that would have on him personally, and how special that made him feel to just have somebody, remember his name, because it had been so long. There was no reason. He'd never bought anything. It wasn't anything like that. There was no particular reason to recall that, but because I was able to do it in the moment, I wasn't fumbling for his name. It meant something to him. It was validating to him. And since that, it just felt a little more personal.
Absolutely. And it's exactly that. What you did by remembering his name is you made a statement to him, you are important to me. That's a very personal thing to say to someone. You're important enough to me that I remember your name after a year. And I remember the names of my clients, even from back in the big game hunting days when I was working that particular market. Many of those people have already passed away. The vast majority of that group have. But I remember them like it was yesterday. If I was able to transport myself back to one of those conventions, I could walk in and start shaking hands and greeting people on a first name basis and pick up a conversation that I had from. So how is that done? You remember the names because you care. You care about this person, and you know that it's important to remember them, and you think about them again after the experience is over, and after you leave and you're at your easel and your mind is going back over things, and you remember, oh, I remember so-and-so when he came in and he asked me this. And of course, my mind works that way. And people say, oh, easy for you to say, you have a photographic memory. Well, I'm not sure what that means.
No.
But I certainly consciously try to remember people's names and faces. And I think that if you're saying, well, I don't have a memory for names and faces, that you haven't trained your memory. You need to train your mind, your memory. And the best thing to do with remembering your clients' names, and that is to register it. It's not that we don't remember the name. We never heard the name properly to begin with. So you repeat it. Repeat the name. That when they introduce themselves, repeat the name. Make a note of it. I'll tell you which names I really remember. It's sometimes difficult just to remember somebody who comes up and kicks some tires and gives you a ration of crap about your artwork. But the ones I remember the names on, I remember names on checks.
Okay.
Somebody hands me a check, I remember their name, believe me.
Okay.
That check amounts to a lot of rent and groceries. That's what it means to you.
Well, hang on a second. So that therein, when you're making a sale and you've got money from your client, this is what I feel, and I've said this in the past in podcasts, where it's a sense of overwhelming gratitude, because by paying you money, they enable you to do that thing which matters to you most. It's this really beautiful transaction. They are validating you in such a way that, hey, I think you're doing a wonderful job. Please keep going. I love this work so much. I'm going to live with it. And of course, you attach now that name and that person with this emotional trigger. And that drives it even further into your memory.
Yeah, I like that. That's exactly right.
You strike me as a sort of guy. You were aware of building a personal brand in the age before Instagram, because now that's what it's all about. You hear people like Gary Vaynerchuk or Gary V talking about this all over his Instagram about building your personal brand. And there's a book that I really like that I've listened to on Audible recently called Crushing It by Gary Vaynerchuk. And what I realized when I was listening to this book is going, well, this echoes so much of what I was brought up with about building the personal brand. Now it's easier for us to do this with the use of social media. But you did this in a real tangible, old school way. And now even though now you're living in the age of Instagram, the internet, websites, Facebook, email lists, all of this, you're still physically interfacing with people. What is it that you think the old school can provide to the new school?
Wow. I'm simply not, I simply don't have the understanding of the new school to be able to address that properly.
Well,
I can tell you what the old school looked like.
Well, let me just.
I'm watching you, and I don't understand.
Well, here's the thing. Let me let me rephrase this in a way, because I love the way that Tony Robbins put this. In the age of information, we're drowning in information, but we're starving for wisdom. So we have all of the gadgets. We have all of the whiz-bang ways of interfacing with our clients, of dealing with people in a direct way, even though it's through cyberspace, but still people are finding it a struggle to make the transition into deriving an income from their creative passion. And to me, I feel like the answer is not necessarily, this is just personally, I feel like the answer doesn't necessarily, exist with beefing up your Instagram account or getting more followers on Facebook or improving your website, that sometimes it can come down to just looking at the physical requirements of the artwork itself, maybe improving your work. So to me, I'd look at that as an old school way of it all comes down to to what you can physically do within your art business, not necessarily just relying on these technological crutches.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't know how to rely on them. Right. I mean, I don't do any of it.
Yeah.
Other than I have a very out of date website, and I have an email address on which people can reach me, and they do.
Wow.
They write to me an email and inquire about whatever they wish to inquire about. And that's the sum. That's the totality of it. They know generally that my website is 10 years out of date, dreadfully in need of a rebuild, not just update it, but rebuild, because my website was built in HTML.
Okay.
And you can't change it. It's not user friendly at all. Right. It's set in stone, and I don't know if anybody even uses that or can speak that language anymore.
I think they can. I mean, our website's an HTML WordPress website, and it can be updated with plugins and all that stuff. So, but I mean, I hear what you're saying.
But this was way before there was any systems that you could plug things in and change them. That wasn't available when my website first went up.
Right.
But so my website does need upgrade desperately, and but I'm not terrible. Things are working so well with it. I can't handle any more work than I've already got.
And isn't that the definition of success right there? Of being
exactly
in a position where you won't see the end to that waiting list.
Well, I know that this sounds weird and even braggartly, but right now I'm having a break. I have absolutely suffered burnout, and I'm having just a little downtime, a little break from the business, because I'm coming off of 8 months of 80 and 100-hour work weeks, and that's not sustainable for anybody. much less somebody who's supposed to be retired.
Yeah.
And I just have been so covered up with it, so busy, and I'm exhausted. I'm physically and mentally exhausted from it. And
Talk to me about this process then, because I remember again from growing up, you told me when I was a kid, Andrew, I only have time in my life for two things, my art and my family. You stayed true to your word. I remember you cut everything else out. So for somebody who's living and breathing their artistic passion, how do you get burned out? If this is everything too, yeah, how does that even happen?
You get burned out. First, art isn't all creative.
Okay.
Okay? There are creative aspects of it that are very personally satisfying, very fulfilling. But there's always parts of your business that are just plain work. And so consequently, I can be very involved and wound up about producing a new piece of work. And I love that, and I never get tired of that. But then, after I've done it, I have to build the mold. And that's just hard work. Oh, you could pay somebody to build the mold, but if you're as picky as I am, they won't do as good a job as you would. And they're going to charge you a lot of money for it. And you can't ship your original safely to them. They're certainly not going to come to you. I mean, I live about as remote as you can get in far north Queensland. I mean, I'm out literally in the rainforest.
In Australia,
No,
the top northeast corner of Australia.
That's right. That's right. I'm as far away from the world as I can get.
Right.
And it's quiet here.
I think I win. I think I'm further away from the world.
I don't know.
Actually, maybe we have more people in this town than you have in your town. How many people are in your town?
I think there's 70.
Okay, you win. We got 480 here.
Well, it's tiny.
Yeah.
And we got 2 streets. And we, it's a tiny country community.
Yeah.
And the properties here are larger.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Sorry, I got you off track there.
Yeah, I'm well off track now. I don't know if I'll ever find my way back. I don't know. I was going to say something. Burnout. Yes, burnout. I definitely am burnout. How do you burn out when you enjoy what you're doing? So much of what I was doing, I did my originals. There's no burnout in that. Then I had to build the molds, pull the master copies out of those molds, pack the molds up, send them to the foundries, have them cast. Then you can't send stuff out of the foundry the way the foundry gives it to you. So you have to go personally to put your personal touch and ensure that it's exactly the way you want it. And that's just hard work.
Wow.
And so a lot of it, more than half of it, is not the creative end of it. And building molds is a nasty, dirty process. You're working with liquid rubber and fiberglass resin and urethane castings and stuff, and it's heavy work. And it certainly doesn't occur in this studio. I mean, I have a big garage out there to work in.
Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the process then. Can you take us from the beginning? You're going to do a life-size rhino, let's say. Let's say the rhino that's behind you in your studio, the rhino right. and the calf. And right. How does that start? So we've talked about the process of you get the order from the zoo and you have the buyer for the piece, and now you're starting the process. So can you walk us through the nuts and bolts of creating this work of art?
Right. Well, first, you have to have a vision of what you want to achieve. You have to have a concept. And you go through a process of concept development, design development, where you try to analyze it and make decisions about what could be done that would improve the piece. And you do that in repeating cycles. You do it, you correct it, you analyze it again, you make those corrections, you analyze it again. It's very much like editing the manuscript of a book. Goes back to the editors, except in this case, you are the writer, the author, and the editor. And it means you are responsible for the way the piece is released. Don't pass the buck to anybody else. Just because you don't like doing editing, you can't get out of it. You have got to edit it and improve it and make it as good as you can. All right. So then I start off small and I model it and I do a small scale figure. So here is a model of this rhinoceros. And you see that it's about 5 inches long and about 2.5 inches tall, but it's fairly detailed. Now this is a bronze casting of that piece. From this piece, I needed to refine it and add more detail to it. So I did the piece again, just a bit larger. So there it is, larger. That piece is about 1 foot or 300 millimeters tall and about 2 feet or 600 millimeters in length. So now that's getting me up into the point that that's about 1/5 scale for the life-size piece. Now, at that point, you have an option of which road you're going to go down. The conventional road, the one I have always taken, is that I then begin to build that at the full scale, the full size that I'm going to produce the life-size bronze. And I've done that for 40 years. Just get straight into it and blow it up and carefully measure it and enlarge the piece and put all the detail into it I want. Then I build the mold. The mold consists of a rubber jacket that goes over the clay original and a support case, a rigid support case, and other people use plaster. I use fiberglass boat hull specifications. That supports the rubber and keeps the rubber from distorting. In that mold, you would cast a wax duplicate, and that wax duplicate goes through the lost wax process. That is, plumbing is attached to it, and then the entire piece, the wax and the plumbing, is covered with a fireproof material that goes into the furnace. In the heat of the furnace, the wax burns out, burns away, vaporizes, and leaves a cavity. The foundry then takes bronze, melts the bronze, pours the bronze into the cavity, which the wax had originally occupied. And when that cools, they break the fireproof shell off the outside, revealing the bronze duplicate of your wax or of your clay original several steps before. That's not the end of it. It has to be cleaned up, welded together, assembled, and colored, the finish put on it, which is called a patina. And these are all very time-consuming and expensive processes. It's expensive whether you do it yourself or whether you hire a foundry to do it. I choose to do the molds myself, the original and molds myself, and then I hire the foundry to do the metal pouring, the assembly, the grinding, And then I come in at the last minute for the patina and final finish. Does that make it clear?
Yeah, absolutely. So you basically, so what you're doing is the same process for something that is the size of a paperweight, and it's pretty much identical for something up to the size of you did a mammoth, a life-size mammoth.
Yes.
Yeah, I had no idea when I was 6 years old, climbing on the tusks of that mammoth. I just thought, oh, my dad made a mammoth. I didn't even get the concept. But then when I got older, I was like, holy mackerel, you made a mammoth.
Yeah.
So you're obviously casting something up to that size in pieces and welding it together as well.
Yeah. Well, the mammoth was a lot of pieces. The mammoth was, I once again, I did my study models at various scales, various sizes, and I enlarged it myself, and I built a life-size mammoth in wax and plywood and brown paper. Built it up,
Wow.
built a,
Yeah.
a rigid armature, much like those wooden toys that you see dinosaurs or other skeletons, where the sheets of wood interlock and they slot together.
Yeah,
Well,
you got those for me when I was a kid. I remember having a T-Rex, a pterodactyl, all kinds.
yeah. So I made very much the same thing, but instead of using a real thin sheet of wood, I used half-inch plywood. And on the Mammoth, it actually took 50 sheets of half-inch ply, 50 sheets of half-inch plywood, and a bundle of 4x2s, or as they say in the U.S., 2x4s.
Right, right. Yeah.
So a whole bundle of housing studs, and I used all of it up. And then after I got this slotted together wooden toy sculpture, I covered it with brown paper glued together with homemade wallpaper paste. Just plain white flour boiled in water and applied as a paste, and I made my own tape, and I covered the entire wooden structure with this paper tape, and that gave me a surface over which to put my sculpture medium. In that case, it was a wax medium. Later, I went to almost entirely to a clay-based medium. But
Wow.
it was a big job.
We're coming up on nearly 2 hours. We have talked for hours and hours and hours in the past. Normally, we'd have conversations that would go all afternoon. I'm gonna have to get you to come back on the podcast, Dad. If you'd join me again, we'll.
No, I don't think so. This is enough. I mean, really, don't push your luck. Oh, don't twist my arm.
I will twist your arm. Hey, listen, before we part company this afternoon, let's let me bring it back to the business side of art and monetizing your creative passion. With the benefit of this experience you've gathered over your life, finding yourself in the position that you are now, making a really comfortable living from your art. I'm not afraid to say you are the most successful artist I personally know. I've met a lot of artists, and I just, of course I look up to you, Dad, but I recognize you as being one of the most amazing success stories that I've ever come across, and that's been enormously beneficial for me because I got to see this example in you. So let's say you had the opportunity to go back and give your younger self the benefit of this experience and the success that you have now. What would be the advice that you would give to yourself as a 12-year-old?
As a 12-year-old.
Or a 10-year-old, whatever you like, as a kid.
Well, I would say this. Practice your artwork. Do it. We learn by doing. Experience is everything. Just do it. Now, I didn't have to be encouraged to do it. I was driven to do it. I was obsessed about it. I was compulsive about it. I had to do it. Nobody asked me to do it. They had to stop me from doing it to get me to do my math or my homework or whatever. If given the opportunity, I was doing my artwork. So you know, if somebody has, if you have to hold your own feet to the fire, perhaps that's not your calling. Don't torture yourself. If you don't enjoy this more than anything else, well, perhaps you're looking in the wrong direction for satisfaction. You should follow your heart. You should do what really speaks to you. If it's artwork, great, then do it. Practice it. Do it over and over. You know, there are sayings, and I like old wives' tales or adages or old cliche sayings. I like those. I collect them. There's a saying that says, everybody has 20/20 vision in hindsight. And I've added to that. You can have hindsight too. 20/20 vision. All you have to do is be prepared to do it over again. That's the secret to improving the quality of the artwork. Do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. And it reminds me of something I saw on television when televisions were little tiny screens and black and white only. And on Saturday morning, there was an art show. And these were terribly badly produced shows. But on one of these art shows, they had a guest, and he was a Chinese painter. He did Chinese ink brush paintings. And he did, I can still remember, he did some bamboo stalks was one painting, and another painting was a little crab. And it really got my attention. It was so simple, so elegant. He had it down so well. And he told the audience in his broken English that the way to do this is that one year he chose to do the crab. So he painted the crab. Every day he painted that crab painting, one painting every day for a year. And at the end of the year, he knew how to paint the crab. And then he spent a year painting the bamboo. Every day he did it over again until it was magic. He just reached his arm out with his paintbrush, touched the canvas, and it left a perfect leaf. It was shocking. You can apply, you don't have to be so extreme about it, but you can apply that same principle to improve your artwork or improve anything else. Persistence. It's not over until you say, that's it, that's as good as I can do. And you know what? That you're not telling yourself the truth when you say that, because you always can do better. All you have to do is be prepared to do it again.
Well, Dad, this has been awesome having you on the podcast. A real pleasure for me. Tell people out there where they can see some of your work.
Well, obviously, they can see some of my work, a lot of my work at your local zoo. So if you are near one of the big zoos, it's likely they'll have some bronze, and that's likely to have my name on it. I think I have more bronzes in more zoos than anyone else. If they can't get to the zoo, or can't find my work, or just want to look it up, you can look it up online at tomtischler.com, and there you'll see pictures of my bronzes in zoos.
Thank you so much for doing this, Dad. It's been awesome. And I'll look forward to getting you on the podcast again sometime.
Great. Thanks for having me on, Andrew.
Well, I really hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Creative Endeavour podcast, and a big thank you to my father, Tom, for joining me. Again, if you want to see more of my dad's work, then make sure you click that link in the description down below. He can be found at www.tomtischler.com. Now, a word of warning, his website's really out of date, but you can find some pictures of his magnificent bronze sculptures on there. Now, if you liked this video, then please hit that like button for me and leave me a comment down below. And if you want to come back for more and see more episodes of the Creative Endeavour podcast or some of my painting tutorials, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook, but most important, make sure you're subscribed through my website. It's free to do so. Simply enter your name and email address, and I'm in touch with my subscribers regularly. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I look forward to being with you again soon.